Well, welcome to our 10th lesson in the series Unshakable Faith. I hope you're doing well this week. I hope that somehow, in the midst of a very strange period of time in our world, that you're finding peace and joy. And I want you to know that I'm praying for you, for everyone in our class and who joins virtually through this study. Uh, I'm going to encourage you to print out the handout that was attached to the email that you received from church if you are accessing the video study that way. And we'll have some scriptures to read, and I'll be right there for you. So just pause this video if you want to, and then we'll jump right into it. Okay, so let's just get right into our study today. We're going to be looking at the story of Moses in Hebrews chapter 11, and of course in the original back in the book of Exodus in the Old Testament. If there was ever a person that deserved to be in the Faith Hall of Fame, it's got to be Moses. Man, what a giant of faith. What a guy. And we're going to just, first of all, start with just a brief review of a couple of things we talked about last week. And then we're going to have a guest talk some about 21st century faith, not back in Old Testament times, but right here in our community and in the 21st century. And then we'll get into today's lesson about Moses. So what I want you to think about, if you've got a copy of the handout available, the review question here is, how do the burial plans of Jacob and Joseph reflect the values of Abraham and Sarah that were described back in chapter 11, verses 13 through 16? And we know that the core value that Abraham and Sarah lived by is that they accepted the fact that they were foreigners and strangers and exiles and nomads on earth, that their real true home was not going to be right here. So they didn't need to get comfortable in their culture. They needed to accept the fact that they were in transition. You know, in our modern day language, they didn't even get a green card. Okay, they had a temporary visa on this earth. So when it came time for Jacob to die, way down there in Egypt, he told Joseph, he said, look, I'm going to die, but I don't want you to bury me down here in Egypt. I know Egyptians are big on big funerals, big tombs, big mummies, big treasure. You know, I don't want that. I want you to promise me that you will take me back to the promised land and bury me where my grandfather Abraham and my father Isaac are buried, back there, because that's the land of promise. That's where God promised us that he was going to build us into a great nation. Now, I can't see right now how that's going to happen. We're pretty well set here in Egypt. There's a famine back there. That's okay. God will keep his promise. You bury me back there, because that's home. In the same way, Joseph, when at the end of his life, just like Jacob had, but Joseph said, he said, just put me in storage, and when you leave, and you will leave, when you leave, you take me with you and bury me back there in the promised land. That took 430 years, okay, that Joseph was, that his mummy, probably was a mummy, yeah. And so there's a great book to be written, a great movie to be made about finding Joseph's mummy back there in modern day Israel, Jordan, that area back there. And, if you write the book, you just have to give me like 2% on the profits or whatever. But anyway, a great story there. At any rate, Joseph still had the vision. He said, Egypt, I'm a high official in Egypt. We've got our own land here. We're living in the Goshen province. Things are going well for us. But this is temporary. Our real home is back there in the promised land. And so he bought into the vision of Abraham and Sarah, also that they've been called to become a special nation, that God would bless all nations through them. Okay, so what I'd like to do is just to pause right now and jump into an interview with Dr. Matt Shaner. So just give me a second. Okay, today we want to supplement our study of Unshakable Faith with another interview of one of our favorite brothers and sisters, Dr. Matt Shaner. Matt is in the marketing department at Ole Miss. He's a professor at Ole Miss, and he is a devoted Christian, has a lovely wife, Jennifer, and they have 3 children sharing their quarantine at home right now, Gavin and Josie and Cade. So we really appreciate Matt taking his time and sharing some from his own life. So just to get started, Matt, why don't you tell us a little bit about your spiritual journey and tell us when you became a Christian?
Yeah, thanks, Doug. So my spiritual journey, I grew up in a family, as many members of our church did, although obviously not all. I grew up in a family that were members of the church before I was born. In fact, going back several generations, even on one line of my family to the start of the Restoration movement in the Churches of Christ. I've got a long family history in the church. And so, I don't remember a time when we, didn't go to church, when I wasn't in Sunday school as a kid. And so I've grown up around a community of faith. When I was a preteen, kind of transitioning from elementary school to junior high school, I became a Christian and was baptized. Obviously, baptism is a start. It's not the end of the journey. And so that was 30, 40 some odd years ago. And ever since then, my faith has continued to evolve. There's been some ups and downs along the way, but in a large part, I have to credit my parents and my family for a lot of my faith. And I'm sure we'll get into this as we chat, but one of the challenges I've had is like, how do I make something that belonged to my family and make it belong to me and make it my own faith?
Well, if let's just use a metaphor here. If your faith were a building and you're constructing this building as you live your life, and you're up on the third or fourth floor now, whatever. What's the foundation? If we go back down and look at what the basic foundation for your faith is, what would you say?
Well, I think there's a practical foundation and a more of a doctrinal, spiritual foundation. The practical foundation, like I mentioned, is the fact that I've had a community of believers that I've grown up with. So I've had spiritual encouragement from friends and family. I think it's probably worth noting too that I went to a Christian university, and I married a Christian woman, and so I continued to build on a foundation. That's the practical aspect. The spiritual part is, regardless of the name on the building, I have a set of core doctrines and theologies that I believe that are, the building blocks of my faith. And that is the God of the Bible, who reveals himself to us in Scripture, is a real entity, that Jesus is the Son of God, that he made a redemptive sacrifice for us, and that he's going to come back to claim his own at some point in the future. I think, and we could we could probably debate different doctrinal things that build on top of that. But I would say at a real fundamental level, I believe that there's a God. I believe that Jesus is his son and what Jesus did on the cross for us. And everything else builds on top of that. And things that don't build on top of that maybe are of lesser importance to me.
Well, if we can just keep talking about architecture, at the end of the Sermon on the Mount in, I believe, Matthew chapter 7, Jesus says, your life is a building, and storms are going to come. And he contrasts, a building built on a rock with a building built on sand. So I wonder if you don't mind sharing the greatest trial of faith that you've experienced. What storm has hit your building?
Sure. And I'm going to extend the metaphor even further.
Okay.
I like to do woodworking and to build things. And when I first started out, I built chairs that fell over and tables that were crooked. So this is not, this journey of faith, it's not something that you get perfectly the first time. It's something that requires commitment and longevity, and you're going to make mistakes along the way. I would say some of my greatest faith trials have just been doubt along the way. You travel the world, you meet people, you encounter different ideas. And sometimes you start to really second guess, like, is this God of the Bible really who he says he is? So I've had times in my life where I really, had to take a step back and really assess what it is that I believe and why do I believe it. So those are probably the biggest faith trials that I've had. But back to the metaphor, you you build a chair or a table that isn't square and it's going to fall over. And so then you reassess and you take some time and you think about it, and you keep pushing forward ahead. And maybe the next time you make one that's more sturdy. And over time, you start to solidify your beliefs and your faith gets stronger, and you become more committed. And quite frankly, the Spirit works on your heart and transforms your mind so that your faith gets bolstered instead of weakened when trials and doubts come.
Well, the way you're describing it, trials and doubts and we might say misfortune or misadventure seems to be a real part of your faith formation. The question is, what did you do before you encountered these trials that prepared your faith to survive it? Was it failure? Was it trying and trying again that makes you stronger for the next trial, or what do you say laid the groundwork for you to be able to not just throw up your hands and walk away from it all?
I would say it starts with good spiritual habits. I've surrounded myself with good Christians, with a good Christian community. So, your feelings can take you. Feelings are good. They're not good or bad, but they can serve a purpose. But your feelings can mislead you. I think a while back I made a commitment, like I'm gonna attend church services as often as I can. I'm gonna engage in some spiritual disciplines that provide me some structure, even when I'm not quote unquote feeling it.
Yeah.
And sometimes it feels like I'm just going through the motions, but it's that foundation that's in place that helps me like stay in the moment and gives me the encouragement to keep pressing forward, even when I'm struggling with doubt or when I'm not just feeling on fire for the Lord. I think sometimes obedience comes before being passionately on fire for God. And sometimes it's the other way around, but I think having those structures in place, having a commitment, like I'm not going to distance myself from the community of believers, can actually help you when you face trials, because it gives you a safety net almost that protects you from straying too far away from the faith.
And maybe you've already answered this question, but when you're in a time of trial, when your faith is taking a stress test, you're tempted to doubt or to give up or to isolate. What do you do then? What's the way that you keep on?
I've got some pretty deep Christian friendships, people that I can call and talk to. I've got a college roommate. We did mission work together in Europe. He's a preacher down in Baton Rouge, and he and I talk on a regular basis. I don't ever want to be permissive of sin, but I want to surround myself with friends who are going to be able to accept me as I am, flaws and all, and gently but lovingly put me back on the right course. And so I think having Christian friends, my spouse, my wife, is somebody I can confide in. So I think often at church, especially, we have this pressure to act like we're perfect Christians and perfect people. If you don't have friends and family with whom
I thought you were perfect, Matt. I'm sorry, I didn't.
I know it seems that way, but
I'm just joking.
If you don't have friends and family that can accept you at flaws and all, that's going to be a struggle for you or problem for your faith too. I think, even though each of us is going to have to stand before the Lord individually, there's a reason that Christ instituted the church, and that's because we need each other.
I really appreciate this time, Matt, and I'm looking forward to a time when we can have this sort of conversation in person. And I just want to pray a blessing on you and your family as you all labor there together today. And again, thanks so much for sharing with our class. We appreciate it so much.
Well, thank you so much, Doug. I appreciate it.
Okay, we'll see you later, okay?
All right, take care.
So we really appreciate Matt being so open and transparent and sharing his life with us. We talk about the fact that there are two kinds of families. There's ideal families, and then there's real families, you know. And so everybody's family has some rough edges. They have some things that really shouldn't be that way. Nobody lives a fairy tale. And boy, Moses, the guy we're going to talk about today, that's especially true of him. So if you just like to read the text for today is in the box on your handout. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and the application of blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land, but when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. Okay, so today's text is all about Moses and his faith, but it's framed by 2 other acts of faith. The first verse, verse 23, is about the act of Moses' parents and how they express their faith through their action. And then the last verse, verse 29, is an act of faith of the entire Israelite nation. And in between we have Moses. Well, Moses is born into a very dark period in the history of the Hebrews, the history of the Israelite people. After so many years, the Egyptians had forgotten about Joseph and his great contributions to saving them from a horrible famine. And they began to be threatened by the Hebrew minority because their population was growing so fast. And so they said, well, you know, let's make they made slave labor out of these people and really oppress them. But still, their numbers kept increasing, and so the king issued a decree that all the male babies should be thrown into the River Nile. Genocide, 1.0 right here. A horrible thing requiring parents to throw their boy babies into the River Nile. We see a parallel in the story of Jesus when Herod killed the boy babies in the city of Bethlehem, where right after Jesus was born, trying to get to Jesus. But just like Jesus escaped, Moses' parents kept him hid for 3 months, and then he escaped the genocide because when they could hide him no longer, they made a little basket, a boat, and put the baby in the basket, and it said throw him in the Nile. They didn't say you couldn't throw him in a boat in the Nile, so they put him in the Nile River over near the edge in some reeds and told his older sister to watch and keep watch there. So while they probably went to work, and who should find him there but Pharaoh's daughter? She adopted him, and he grew up in her household, but with still some interaction with his biological family, so he knew something about his Hebrew heritage. And so when he grew up, he began to see how much the Egyptians were oppressing his people. One day he actually saw an Egyptian beating one of the Hebrew slaves, and he killed the Egyptian. Now, Moses was full of zeal. He was full of fight. He wanted to liberate his people from this evil oppression, but he killed the guy and buried him, hid the body. The next day he saw a couple of Hebrews fighting with each other, and he said, wait, you guys aren't supposed to fight each other. You're both Hebrews. And one of them looked at him and said, are you going to kill me like you killed that Egyptian yesterday? He realized that as we would say, the cat was out of the bag. So he had to leave town in a hurry. This is when he was about 40 years old. You think, what did God have in mind with Moses? Why didn't God lead him? Why didn't he make this, more of a fairy tale where he grows up, he, liberates his people happily ever? No. Moses spends the next 40 years in the Sinai desert, kind of in between modern-day Egypt and modern-day Israel, as a herdsman, following goats around. 40 years looking at the south end of northbound goats. What did God have in mind here? So he spends, 80 years of his life essentially to get to zero. But just look at this. What a graduate school for him. He's got 40 years learning the language and culture of the Egyptians. And then he's got 40 years learning survival techniques in the Sinai Desert. And now he's got his advanced degree in both dealing with Egyptians and getting people alive through the Sinai Desert. Guess what God wants him to do next? To go back to Egypt. And so he goes back to Egypt, and it's a long story. We won't cover the whole thing here. But in the end, he institutes the Passover festival, the most sacred day in the entire Jewish religion. On that night, God's death angel kills all the firstborn of the Egyptians, but because they observe the Passover, they put the blood above their door, outside their door. The Hebrews are spared, and they leave Egypt. The Egyptians say, "Get out of here. We don't want you here anymore. You're bad for us." So they leave. The Egyptian army the Pharaoh has a change of heart. He sends his army out to capture his slaves back, and they make it to the Red Sea, and they're trapped there. The army is coming. The sea is there, and God parts the sea. They walk through the sea on dry land. The Egyptians try to pursue them, and they're drowned when God lets the sea recede back over them. So that's kind of the basic facts of the story of Moses. But you have to say, wait a minute. You know, it's great that Moses' parents had this faith. And it's great that Moses had this faith and he delivered the people. But what about the people that aren't in the story? What about all the little boy babies that got thrown in the river Nile? God? What about them? Did their parents not have faith? I mean, why isn't life more fair? And so we run into a lot of trouble when we try to tell God how to run his universe. And that's the main message of the book of Job. You know, Job says, wait a minute, God, I don't deserve this. In fact, God agrees with him. In the very first chapter of opening chapters of the book of Job, 3 times it says, Job is a really good guy. He's a really good guy. And all of his adult children get killed, boom, at one fell swoop. His business is gone. His servants are gone. His health is gone. And Job is saying, what have I done to deserve this? His friend says, it must have been something. It must have been something because, you know, you're in bad shape, Job, and God doesn't make mistakes. It must have been something. And in the end, God shows up, and he says, Job, who are you to tell me how to run my universe? So even though to you and me it feels terribly unfair that, you know, some of these other boy babies got thrown in the Nile, you know, it's really not up to us to be the arbiters of justice in God's world. The thing I want to spend most of our energy on today, though, is a key decision that Moses made. And it's discussed here in verses 24 and 25. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt because he was looking ahead to his reward. This decision was the decision Moses made to be when he refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Basically, he could have lived the life, what we'd say, of a playboy, of a wealthy person that had no responsibilities. Now, he wouldn't have had a lot of power either. In the ancient world, I kind of get the feeling if you're known as the son of your mother rather than the son of your father, that means that your roots are kind of shady. So, he would have been kind of a second-class rich guy, but he would have been a really rich guy. And he could have lived a life of ease and luxury. Too many times, I think, we try to persuade people to be Christians or encourage people who are already Christians in their Christian walk by saying, follow Jesus. Let him take you in his arms. He will relieve you of your stress. He will comfort you. Your life will be better, and you will be better at life. Try telling that to Moses. When he made this decision that he was not going to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter, he wasn't going to enjoy the luxuries of Egypt, what it says here, the fleeting pleasures of sin. but instead he chose to suffer mistreatment with the people of God, then he incurred all sorts of stress. And what we read about today is just the beginning. Try getting hundreds and thousands of whiny former slaves across the desert. In fact, several times even God got disgusted with them. He said, "Get out of the way, Moses. I'm fed up with this crowd. I'm going to destroy all of them." And Moses would say, "God, let's talk. Let's just calm down, God. Let's talk." Moses is described as the friend of God because he and God had several arguments. Sometimes God won, sometimes Moses won. It's a great story. Anyway, here's a decision that he makes, that he has to go out of Egypt, go out from that culture that he's frankly pretty comfortable in, well stationed in. Who else in Hebrews chapter 11 does this? Well, for sure, Abraham and Sarah. They were well situated in the city of Ur. And God said, leave your culture, leave your father's house and go to a land that I will show you. And here Moses is asked, he's invited, he's forced to leave the comforts of Egypt and adopt a new identity as a leader of a nation of slaves. And then finally, when we get to Hebrews 13, the Hebrew writer clinches his sermon. This whole book of Hebrews can be thought of as a sermon. He clinches his sermon by saying, Abraham did it, and Moses did it, and now it's time for you and me to do it. It's time for us to follow Jesus from the acceptance and comfort of our society to go outside the walls, outside the gate, outside of what was termed acceptable behavior. I'm just going to look down at the bottom. On question 6. We are called to make a decision to depart also. He puts it this way. This is Hebrews 13, verses 11 through 14. The high priest carries the blood of sacrificial animals into the holy place, most holy place, as a sin offering, but the bodies are burned outside the camp. And so Jesus also suffered outside the city gate to make the people holy through his own blood. You don't crucify somebody in the marketplace. You don't crucify somebody at the temple. It's nasty. It's filthy. It's disgusting. It's blood and sweat. It's urine and feces. It's disgusting. It's screaming and cursing and suffering. So you take them out to the garbage dump. And that's where they took Jesus to crucify. And so Jesus also suffered outside the city gate to make the people holy through his own blood. Let us then go to him outside the camp, bearing the disgrace he bore. For here we do not have an enduring city, but we are looking for the city that is to come. Bearing shame and disgrace is a really big thing in the book of Hebrews. If you look back to what it says about Moses, it says he chose to be mistreated along with the people of God. He chose to walk on the wrong side of the street, we would say. In Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, it says that Jesus, despising the shame, went to the cross and runs a race ahead of us. And then in Hebrews 13, it says, let us go to him outside the camp, bearing the disgrace that he bore. So we're called upon to make a decision to depart also. Also in today's text, there are two mentions of fear. In verse 23, it says they were not afraid of the king's edict. And then in verse 27, it says, by faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. Okay, these verses are a bit of a challenge to us for a couple of reasons. First of all, if the dictator of your country, the absolute power, said you've got to dispose of your child, nowadays the problem is people abort little girls. But back then, they wanted to limit the population, limit the national identity, so they said, get rid of the baby boys. At any rate, if you had a baby boy at home and the king made, you would be afraid, okay? But it said that they overcame their fear. They were courageous enough to disobey that edict. And they hid him and protected him. And by the grace of God, by God's providence, he survived and became a great leader. And then it talks about him leaving Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. Well, the first time he left Egypt, he definitely did fear the king's anger because he had murdered a guy, hid the body, and now it had been found out, and he was afraid he was going to be brought, we would say, brought up on charge, arrested, you know. He was afraid he was going to be prosecuted for murder, so he left town in a hurry. I think the Exodus account makes it clear that there's fear involved. But the second time he left Egypt is when he went down there and got all the Hebrew people, and the king said, you can't go. And he kept presenting God's demands and the plagues and so forth. And finally, they did leave. And the king, of course, changed his mind. You ever seen a national ruler that changes their mind a lot? Well, anyway, back to our point. He changed his mind. He went chasing the people. But Moses had so much faith that it overcame his fear. The point being here that unshakable faith allows us to deal with fear. And faith pushes back really hard against our fear. So that's what I'm driving at here. Finally, I want you to notice the end of verse 27. It said, he persevered because he saw him who is invisible. He saw him who is invisible. I mean, that's we call that an oxymoron, a self-contradictory statement. That's like a round square. It's like a white shade of black. It's like, here's a good one, deafening silence. Deafening silence. He saw him who is invisible. In fact, the ability to see something that other people can't see and to be motivated by it is really big in the book of Hebrews. I've listed 2 or 3 Hebrew passages on your handout here on this point, and we're going to begin here next time about the importance of us being able to use our eyes of faith to see the invisible. I hope that God will bless you this week, and I hope you'll continue to be busy and whatever he's called you to do, caring for your family, your loved ones, your parents, your children, your work, your school. I know a lot of you are having to study really hard. It's hard to do just over the computer, but together we will work together, and hopefully very soon we'll be together in person again. Thank you for your attention and your participation in this study.